What connection exists between a late 1800s French short story, some of Jesus' parables, and the Sermon on the Mount? And maybe even most importantly, what do these things have to do with our lives today? Well, we're going to talk about that as we continue with our dive into the Beatitudes. Stay tuned.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you'll also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Life's Key 3 podcast. I'm delighted that you are with me today. We are continuing our look into the Beatitudes. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most famous passages in all of the Bible. It's also one of the longest sections that record Jesus' teaching. And while he was primarily focused on teaching his disciples that were gathered, there was also a huge crowd that was gathered there to listen. And this was early in Jesus' ministry. And he begins by saying some things that definitely were against the common culture of the day. And when he opens and begins to talk about what we've come to call the Beatitudes, which, if you remember, are kind of like the be happies, and not in a fake Pollyanna kind of way of, or a command of, hey, be happy when, but rather what he's talking about is when a person has the right perspective and has stepped into a right relationship with God, there is a result in how they experience life and how they show up in life. And we have looked at what does it mean to be poor in spirit and recognizing we just can't do it on our own. I mean, there's a certain amount of our human effort and willpower that will get us to certain levels of growth and change and maturity. That's true. But eventually, there are things that we just will not have the capacity to do on our own. We will either lack the desire, or we will lack the power, or we will lack both. And out of that poorness of spirit, of that humility of recognizing we need God, not just in those emergency situations, but just in everyday life. We need him in order to have a major change in how we show up in life, how we view the whole purpose and meaning of life. And out of that poorness of spirit and that recognition of our reliance on God, there does come an appropriate mourning, a grieving, a sadness. We don't just acknowledge wrongdoing and kind of laugh it off like, oh yeah, okay, I know that I've got all this stuff wrong in my life, but ha ha ha, no, no big deal. No, a proper perspective will lead us into a state of mourning as we see the needs that we have, and also to be able to have appropriate mourning as we just look around at the world around us. Because if we're honest and you look around at the world in a global scale, things do not look great. It is not like most of the world is at peace. It is not true that most people today will have all of the food and clothing and shelter, just the basics of life, and be able to just go on and to live well above just essential survival. That's not the reality of the world. And there is a condition that we experience, not just as individuals maybe, but as part of humanity that should cause us to have a mourning when we experience the effects of sin, when we experience the effects that things are not as they should be. And then we've also looked at having an attitude of meekness. And again, meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not being whippy. It's not having no desires, or it's not depriving oneself of having ambition or passion or anything like that. That is not meekness. Meekness rather is a state of recognition. It's a state of humility. It's the attitude that says, I'm not going to walk into a place and think, wow, look, I am here. Everybody can now clap and applaud because I have arrived. That is not what meekness is about. Meekness is sometimes tremendous strength of restraint. It is not lashing out even when we have been wronged. And then the other beatitude that we looked at was to hunger and thirst after righteousness. And righteousness is what? It is to have a hunger and a thirst that we will have a right standing with God, that we are living in a way that we have His blessing, His approval, His acceptance. Now, here's the thing. God's love for us is absolutely unconditional. We do not earn it. We cannot do anything to diminish it or to escape from it. But God's blessing on us, His approval for us, is conditional. If you're a parent, then you can understand this in some way. You love your child no matter what, or at least that's what we strive to do. But that does not mean that you are applauding and approving of every single thing that your child does. And if they're still at home, then you can have some way to be able to try to direct them into what is right and what you can approve of. And then as they grow up and they get older and they become adults, then your ability to affect change and to lead them in a direction so that they do what you do approve of becomes less and less. And that is as it should be, because they will take more responsibility for their own life. So as we're tracking through these Beatitudes, it's important to understand that it's not like there are all these little subgroups. Like over here in one part, there's the poor in spirit. And then we look over here to the right and, oh, there's the meek people. And then we look ahead of us and there are the people who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness. And then we turn around and we see other people and it's like, oh, those are the people that are no, these are characteristics of anyone who is a genuine follower of Christ. And just like everything else, these are characteristics that we grow in over time when we choose to align ourselves and to actually do and not just learn about what God said. And so following along with this, when we see how humility, that poorness of spirit, when we begin with that, and then that leads us to an appropriate mourning for the state of our neediness and for the state of the neediness of others, then what does that do? Well, that is going to lead us into a state of meekness, because then we have an understanding that we are needy individuals. And you know what? It's not just us, it's everybody around us. And rather than being irritated and ticked off because other people are needy and they haven't arrived and they don't have it all together, we rather come from a place of understanding and compassion. And then rather than just feeling all of this sadness and awareness of our need for God, then we hunger for Him. And what? And He says, we will be filled. We have something to do with that. And out of that grows then what we're going to talk about today, which is mercy. Mercy is one of those traits that we have something of an understanding of in theory, and is probably kind of like, well, we recognize it when we read about it or when we experience it, but it can be a little hard to really grasp. How do we live that out sometimes in difficult situations? So let me just say from the very beginning, Mercy is not the same thing as the absence of justice. The two do coexist. They are not opposites of each other. And mercy is also not the erasing of responsibility for us or for somebody else. Those are not characteristics of mercy. So let's look at, well, what is mercy? Mercy is the presence of an emotion that moves someone to action. It's both. It's not just emotion and it's not just action. It's both of those things. It is actually feeling a compassion for someone else that is in need, that is strong enough that it causes us to move into action, to do something to try to alleviate their pain and their suffering. You know, we hear the phrase compassion fatigue, and I understand that because being globally connected, we can know about all of the pain and suffering. Well, not all of it, but we can know about more of the pain and suffering that's going on in the world than we have the cognitive ability to grasp. And not only do we read about it, but what technology has brought to us, which has its pros and its cons, but one of the cons that it has brought to us is we can not only hear about or read about pain and suffering, we can see it. And sometimes we can see it live as it's taking place or in very short order. Our brains do process visual images differently than written text and and audio. And so if we see a video of a mass shooting, that is very different in how we process it mentally than if we read about it. So one of the things that we need to be mindful of, just as being good stewards and understand how we are designed biologically, is we need to protect ourselves from the overexposure to all of the suffering and pain that goes on in the world, because eventually we're not designed to be able to withstand all of that. And what can we do? We can actually end up becoming unmerciful people, not because we want to be that way, but in a protective way, because we just can't act on all the pain and suffering that we see in the world. We can't. None of us have the ability to alleviate all the pain and suffering that we have an awareness of. So just on a very practical level, we need to be mindful of how much of that we absorb, whether it's through reading, through listening, certainly through visual input, so that we don't lose the capacity to have mercy present in our lives. Now, mercy involves action. It's not just emotion. And it's really important for us to understand it has to have both. You see, it is possible to do something good, but to not have the right heart behind it. If I am wanting to help someone who is in need financially, okay, I could hand them cash, I could write them a check, I could, do whatever, but that doesn't mean that I have a real heart of mercy behind it. My heart actually could be pretty hard. I could be doing it more about excusing my conscience or making myself look good or whatever. But mercy is different than that. When I'm acting out of a heart of mercy, then I am going to be moved because I care about that other person or those individuals, not just because I'm trying to alleviate my own guilt or a sense of obligation or just make myself look good. But mercy is also not only the presence of emotion. We can do a disservice to others and we can actually become self-deceived when we give too much credibility to the emotions that we experience. It's fine to experience emotions, but here's the thing. Emotions are only a certain measurement of our real character. They're not enough to measure who we really are. And sometimes we can go down this path of self-deception because we think, well, I feel this. I feel this so intensely. I have such great emotion about this person or whatever. Okay, that's all well and fine as a beginning place, but we always have to look at, okay, but what are the actions that that emotion is leading to? Because if it's not leading to actions, it's not mercy. And we really have to start questioning, are we looking at those emotions as a way to justify ourselves, or are we willing to do the hard work of honestly examining our motives in a situation? In this parable, Jesus says that blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain. They will be recipients of mercy. And I think that that is both from God and it's also from other people. Now, that does not mean that every single person that you show mercy to is going to turn around and show mercy to you. And Jesus actually tells a story, what we call a parable, to illustrate this. And this isn't right there with the Beatitudes. This comes later in his teaching. But he tells the story of a man who has a debt that is so massive. There is no way he will ever be able to earn enough money to pay this debt off. I don't know how that debt happened, but this guy is in so far over his head, he's never going to stand a chance to get out. And what happens is he's called before the king to give an account and to pay up this debt. I work out a payment plan, whatever. And there's the recognition it's hopeless. He is never going to be able to pay this debt back. And so he pleads and he begs for what? He pleads and he begs for mercy, for forgiveness of the debt, for time, even. And the king responds with what? He responds with mercy. Why? He has compassion for the man, but then that compassion leads to action. And the king says, okay, I am going to totally write off your debt. I'm not just giving you more time. I'm not just working out better terms. I'm not just lowering the interest rate or whatever. I am erasing your debt. I will absorb the cost of your debt that you cannot pay back, because debts always have a cost that somebody absorbs. And this man leaves and he is so grateful, so it seems, until he goes out and he finds someone else who owes him money, and a very small amount of money, an amount of money that the second debtor could over time reasonably be expected to pay back to him. And does this first man who had his entire debt wiped out, does he respond to that by forgiving and erasing this very small debt? Nope, that's not what he does. And not only does he not erase the debt, but he doesn't allow for any more time. He doesn't work out a payment plan. He is incredibly harsh. He takes this man and says, I'm not going to give you more time. I'm going to have you thrown into prison until you can pay off this debt. Well, how is somebody supposed to pay off a debt when they were in prison? Well, that responsibility then would fall to the man's family and friends and relatives, and that was going to double, triple, quadruple the burden, because then he's in a place where he can't even contribute to raising the funds to pay off this debt. Just because a person receives mercy does not mean they will respond with mercy. And that's something we just want to be mindful of as we choose to be merciful people. It's not a position that we take so that we can get something back. It's not like, well, okay, I'm going to show them mercy, but I'm going to file away in my mind that now I'm going to have an expectation that they're going to show me mercy when I need it. That's not true mercy. Rather, we show mercy in response to the mercy that God has shown to us, not as some sort of down payment on a future mercy plan that we think that we might need from someone else. Now, it's also interesting that we need to see the second half of this beatitude, which is that merciful people also will receive mercy. Have you ever known someone who was really good at giving and really bad at receiving? Maybe even you. I don't know. I could maybe be raising my hand over here for that. At least I think that's what maybe my kids have mentioned to me a time or two before. Well, merciful people don't just give mercy. Truly merciful people also receive it. And they can receive that from God, and they receive it from other people. And this is also a way that we can mark, are we really growing in mercy? It's not just about the mercy that we are giving to others. It's also about the willingness that we have to receive mercy that is offered to us from others. Now, I talked very early in the podcast about the late 1800s French story and Jesus' parables and the Sermon on the Mount. So what I want to talk to you about is, if you're not familiar with this short story from the French writer Guy de Maupassant, then you have to look it up. This is my all-time favorite short story. It was written in the late 1800s, called The Necklace. And I don't want to say a whole lot about it, because if you haven't read it yet, I don't want to give it away. But one of the things that we see in this brilliant story is the cost that comes when a person is unwilling to ask for mercy and to position themselves to receive it. So, I don't want to give the story away. If you're not familiar with it, you've got to go look that up. It's an easy find online. It's just called The Necklace, and you want to read the fullness of that story. And then also, of course, we have Jesus' parables where he talks and he shows mercy. One of the most famous of those is, of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And here we see someone who acted with extravagant mercy. The person actually who was the most culturally unlikely to show mercy. And it's interesting because in one of those passages, the person that had come to Jesus that prompted that whole story had asked about commandments, who was the greatest commandment and all of that. And then Jesus answers that. And then the man comes back and says, okay, yeah, well, who is my neighbor? Because Jesus had said, about loving our neighbor. And they go, okay, well, qualify that for me, Jesus. I mean, explain to me exactly who fits into that category and who doesn't. This guy does not have a merciful heart. He wants to be very clear about which people are entitled to his help and which ones are not. And when Jesus tells this story of the Good Samaritan, and then he asks the question, which one of those people showed mercy? Do you know that the man who had asked the question can't even bring himself to use the word Samaritan? They were so hated by the Jews. There was such enmity between those groups of people that this man wouldn't even use the word Samaritan. Rather, what he says is, the one who showed mercy. Even when we don't like the person, even when we can't stand the individual who shows mercy, we still tend to recognize it when we see it. One of the things that I also mentioned earlier was that we need to have a correct understanding of what mercy is and is. And this is where it can get a little tricky, because sometimes we take a little bit of what's true and we explode it up, and it becomes a way that it almost as if it cancels out the other part of truth. Mercy is the release of a debt. It is saying, I'm not going to hold you to account that you have to pay off the debt that you have to me. It might also be mercy that says, you don't owe me a debt, but I can see that you're in pain and suffering. And I am going to not hold you responsible for being in that situation. And yet, how do we do that when people get themselves into bad situations? How do we address this whole concept of mercy when people do sin against us? And this is where it is important to understand that one form of mercy, which is forgiveness, forgiveness is not the restoration of trust. Those are two separate issues, closely connected, but still separate. It's like my muscles and my bones, very closely connected, I hope. I mean, in healthy bodies, that's usually the case that you find. But they are definitely not the same things. If I break my bone, I want my physician to be able to go in and to address the issue with my bone. I don't want them getting confused and thinking they're going to do something with my muscles instead. And mercy and forgiveness and trust are like that. We can show mercy through forgiveness and releasing a debt, but that is not the same thing as restoring trust with that individual. But mercy is more than just giving forgiveness when somebody has wronged us. Mercy is also just seeing people in need. Doesn't have to be people we know. It doesn't have to be people that we owe anything to because of promises made. It doesn't have to be people that are in situations that we have any personal responsibility for causing or contributing to. It's just seeing people in need and responding with the emotion that leads to action. You know, there's a verse in the Old Testament, Hosea 6, verse 6, and that's a book that doesn't get a lot of press. It's a small, minor prophet book in the Old Testament. But Jesus quoted from this verse, and he says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." What is he saying here? And there's other references throughout the Old and New Testament where God makes it clear he's not after sacrifice. He's after a heart of justice and mercy. Now, today, we don't practice animal sacrifice. I'm not just talking about sacrifice in terms of the Old Testament law of giving up a sheep or a goat or another type of animal. Rather, it is sacrificing the things that we hold dear to us, but they're not necessarily good for us. They're not in alignment with how God is calling us to live. You know, every time that someone in the Old Testament or in the New Testament before the coming of Christ, when they gave an animal as a sacrifice in obedience to God, there was a cost to that. I mean, they were giving up something that had economic value to them. And in the same way, when we have mercy at work in our lives, there are things that we are going to give up. But again, it comes from a right heart of compassion for others, not just, okay, I'm gonna have this outward action and then I can check off my box. Okay, I've helped them out, therefore I'm good and I can move on. Any characteristic, any character trait, any practice that Jesus specifically identified is something that we really want to pay attention to. And in the Beatitudes, these are specific. There are times when we look at Jesus' teaching that if we're honest, we're like, I'm just not really exactly sure what you meant by that. That seems a little obscure there, Jesus, and what you were talking about. But the Beatitudes are not obscure. We can understand mourning and hungering and thirsting after a right standing with God. We can understand humility and meekness, and we have an understanding of mercy. So let's just make the decision that mercy will be something that we intentionally pray and ask God both to receive and to be people who walk with a heart of mercy in this world. Because if there is one thing that we need a whole lot less of, and that is arrogance, and that is ignorance, and that is I'm going to get my way and my opinion's going to prevail and everybody's going to know what I think and I'm going to get mine and I'm going to hold you to account and you're going to make sure you pay the last penny. And whether that is economically or whether that is having to, quote, pay the last penny in terms of relationship, in terms of I'm going to cut you off, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, I'm going to put you down. All those different ways that we show up in life that are not merciful. And how much better would we be as individuals, and how much better would we be as humans and in our groups, our businesses, our churches, our schools, our organizations, our communities, if we chose to become people who practiced and received mercy. So let's not just, be a listener of the word and think, oh yeah, that all sounds good. But let's follow what Jesus said and actually be doers of the word and pray and look for where can you show up. Maybe you need to request mercy and maybe you need to show it. All right, my friend, that's going to wrap us up for today. I just want you to be mindful, if you haven't already, go to the website, stephaniepresents.com, sign up for the weekly newsletter, High Impact, over there. And I'd also love to hear from you. Leave a rating and a review. That is a tremendous help. And remember this, because it is absolutely true, you have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.